Rain hammered the hospital's glass like 1,000 impatient fingers, while Emily Hart, belly tight and breath staggered, gripped the chrome rails of room 208 and stared at the man who should have been her anchor. Daniel stood at the window with his back half turned, his face washed in the blue light of a phone that kept buzzing as if it owned him, as if it were the real emergency. She whispered his name, and he offered a sigh that sounded like a door closing, then a flat, just breathe, without eyes, without hands, without presence. And when the screen flashed the name she already feared, Veronica Steele, something inside Emily tore louder than the contraction, not muscle, but faith. The nurse, steady and practiced, tightened the monitor cuff and scolded him softly, and for a heartbeat he grazed Emily's arm with a borrowed touch before the next message pulled him away like a tide. "Be right back," he said, and the door clapped shut, and in the silence that followed, Emily learned a new clock where minutes lengthened into corridors and hope shrank to the size of a ringtone that never came. She tried calling, 2 rings, voicemail, then folded under a surge of pain so clean it blurred the ceiling tiles. The nurse's voice was a braided rope: count, breathe, hold. And in that rhythm, Emily found a small ledge of calm where a decision waited. If he didn't come back, she would deliver without him and live without him. He returned an hour later, with rain on his hair and rehearsed calm in his mouth, said, "We need to talk," and ended their marriage like a memo: small dreams, outgrown life, a better path. His sentences polished where his courage should have been. When she named the name, Veronica, his silence confessed, and her reply arrived as steady as the beep on the monitor: "Go. If you walk out now, don't come back." He left. The air changed. Even the light felt lighter without his shadow. The nurse squeezed Emily's hand and called him a fool, then reset the room with competence that felt like love. The next pushes were a storm and a doorway, and when the baby's cry broke open the space, Emily sobbed from a place where grief and joy crossed arms and agreed to share the room. Hours later, when the room dimmed to lamplight and the rain gentled to a cold lace on the glass, her phone brightened with a message from the lead investor, the thread she'd guarded in secret conference rooms and parking lot calls, the future she'd been building while Daniel misspelled her capacity. Deal closed, $10 billion secured, funds transferred. She read it twice, not because she doubted, but because victory is a flavor you should taste on the back of the tongue where memory keeps it. She did not forward it, did not gloat, did not summon witnesses. Instead, she pressed her lips to the baby's temple and made a quiet vow: this child will grow in a house where respect arrives on time. Across town, a limousine door swallowed Daniel and delivered him into Veronica's leather and chrome world, where praise came measured and conditional, results not noise, image not intimacy. He mistook the elevator's rise for his own. She mistook him for a tool she might use twice. But Emily had already stepped onto a different stair, the kind that holds because it is built on work, and the board would call in the morning to put a public name to what she had already earned in private. She slept in pockets, woke to the warm weight of a future that would not need him, and hid her only sentimentality in a single sentence on a sticky note inside the bedside drawer: forgiveness is not a return ticket. In the morning, she asked for her discharge and signed with a hand that did not shake. She thanked the nurse, cradled her son, and left the hospital as she would enter every room from now on, calm, composed, unafraid to be seen. Behind her, the rain cleaned the streets. Ahead, a city waited to learn what a woman becomes when the door closes and she chooses, instead of breaking, to build. By sunrise, the rain had rinsed the city into a brighter version of itself, and Emily moved through her quiet apartment like someone cataloging a new country, checking the crib screws with one hand, answering the board's early call with the other, voice low and sure while her son slept in a swaddle that looked like a promise. The directors were crisp, celebratory, and unanimous in their phrasing. The merger's public rollout in 2 weeks would crown her as the face of the deal, the steward of integration, the new CEO whose name would anchor headlines and steady shareholders. She accepted with the same measured calm she had used to build the numbers that made them believers, setting follow-ups for legal, comms, and culture without letting bravado leak into the room. She did not talk about Daniel, did not offer a backstory, because the work needed no myth to validate it. When the call ended, she warmed a bottle, watched tiny eyelids flutter, and let the ordinary beauty of the moment undercut the scale of the news. Leadership would have to make room for lullabies, and she would make room for both. Across the city, Veronica's penthouse ran on stainless steel quiet and calendars that stacked like glass. Daniel learned quickly that praise in this altitude arrived in the grammar of deliverables. No endearments, just expectations. No tenderness, only timelines. Veronica listened to his updates the way a jeweler inspects a cut, then redirected him toward the deals that mattered, her voice a corridor with no side doors. He mistook her proximity for partnership, not noticing that she never once asked what he wanted, only what he could perform. His new suits fit, his new elevator rose, and yet each mirror offered a faint delay before reflecting him, as if the building itself was deciding how much of him to show. Emily opened the blinds and let a halved sun stripe the floor, then sketched an integration brief in the Notes app between feedings, outlining how to stabilize teams before optimizing them, how to measure real impact alongside revenue, how to convert a headline into durable value. She messaged HR to prepare childcare stipends and told comms to scrub any language that sounded triumphant for triumph's sake. Let results do the boasting. She scheduled a walkthrough with engineering, reserved the first all-hands for the second week post-announcement, and penciled in a quiet visit to the community center that had lost a grant last year. When her sister called, she kept it simple. "We're okay, really," and meant it. Meanwhile, Veronica's driver ferried Daniel to a lunch where the table's centerpiece caused more than his old car, where laughter was as curated as the art on the walls. He shook the right hands, nodded at the right remarks, and left with a stack of follow-ups he didn't know how to translate into leverage. Whispers followed him, soft, speculative, tied to Veronica's name rather than his own. And he told himself it didn't matter as long as doors kept opening. That afternoon, Emily stood in front of the bathroom mirror and practiced saying we, not I, because the merger would live or die by the sense of shared authorship she could summon. She tried on the navy suit that cameras would soon memorize and set it back in the garment bag, choosing instead a cotton tee for a nap on the couch beside the bassinet. Before her eyes closed, she wrote a single sentence on a fresh page of a small notebook. Greatness that doesn't make room for gentleness will eventually mistake cruelty for strength. Evening washed the windows orange, and the city shifted into its confident night. Emily woke to the soft rustle of the baby and the soft ping of a calendar reminder. Investor prep at 8, pediatric visit at 10, brand brief at noon, a grocery list at 4. Somewhere high above, Veronica watched the skyline and moved 3 deals like chess, then turned to Daniel and said, "Results by Friday," which sounded like opportunity but felt like a timer. Emily dimmed the lights, lifted her son, and swayed in a slow figure 8 that made the room feel like a harbor. Then lay him down and opened her laptop to refine a slide titled, "Culture First, Then Speed," knowing the week would ask her to be iron and water at once, and knowing she already was.
The week unfurled like a taut ribbon toward the announcement, and Emily treated each day as both rehearsal and performance. Tight agendas at sunrise, soft-bellied pauses at noon for bottles and burps. Then back to the ledger of decisions that would define not just a headline, but horizon. She began with the map no one else had drawn yet, the one that threaded culture through code and policy through product. Opening her laptop while her son dozed and sketching 3 imperatives in clean language: stabilize, humanize, then accelerate. Stabilize meant briefings with engineering leads who had built competing tools and were now expected to collaborate without losing pride. So she booked a whiteboard room, rolled the markers into her palm and said, "We're not erasing what you've made. We're deciding how 2 good things become 1 necessary thing." Humanize meant an HR sprint where childcare stipends, mental health coverage, and transparent growth bands weren't branded as perks, but as the standard operating system of the new company. Accelerate would wait until the first 2 stuck, and she tucked that word behind her teeth like flint she'd strike only when the tinder was ready. Between calls, she walked the corridor with a baby monitor clipped to her shirt, the nursery's hush leaning into the study's hum, and she let the quiet teach her what noise tries to drown. that pace without purpose just feels like panic. She wrote a note to comms that began, "No confetti language," and ended with, "Let our work be the proof." Then added a line to legal, "Review vendor contracts for predatory clauses that had slipped through when speed outran scrutiny." In another part of the city, Veronica's penthouse ran like a clock expensive enough to keep its own weather, and Daniel learned its time zones by the way her voice shifted when money entered the room. She seated him at a glass table with a skyline for a wall and slid a deck toward him. Targets, timelines, names that mattered, and asked him to own the outreach, which he translated as "be seen with the right people," which she did not bother to correct. At lunch with financiers, he rode her reputation like an elevator that always knew the right floor, introducing himself in a way that pinched at the truth, strategic lead, point on expansion, while Veronica said little and watched everything. By the time dessert found the table, he had agreed to deliver 3 introductions and a pitch he hadn't yet learned to make without borrowing someone else's sentences. Emily arrived at the office by midweek with the baby in a sling and a meeting in her pocket that mattered more than the camera test scheduled afterward. She met with a small cohort of employees who had survived 3 layoffs and 2 bad bosses and still showed up with intact curiosity. "Tell me what would keep you here," she asked, and then shut up long enough to hear answers that sounded like oxygen. Clear paths, technical mentorship, leadership that could admit, "I don't know," fast enough to learn. She wrote their names down and later sent them handwritten notes that said, "You belong here," not as performance, but as practice. The camera test went fine, the navy suit hung right, the mic found her voice's deeper register, and she remembered to breathe past the ribs when she said "we" instead of "I." Afterward, she visited the community center that had lost a grant, sat on a metal chair in a room that smelled faintly of varnish and hope, and asked the director what a real partnership would look like. "Not a photo op," she said, "a pipeline." They drafted a plan on butcher paper with marker caps clicking like metronomes. Internships, a refurb of the computer lab, a speaker series taught by her engineers who remembered being locked out of rooms and were grateful for the chance to unlock one for someone else. Daniel, meanwhile, scrolled past a photo of Emily in a trade publication. Just a thumbnail, just a caption about a rising architect of consolidation, and felt a mismatch between the image he'd held of her and the one the world was starting to hold. He tamped it down with the easy lie he'd been telling himself. She liked small, and went back to a follow-up email that sounded hungry without meaning to, hoping Veronica would read hunger as drive. When he told her later that evening that an investor who took his call, Veronica's smile was exact. "Good," she said. "Bring me outcomes, not anecdotes." Then turned to a live term sheet and left him on the lip of a silence that felt like a test he wasn't sure how to pass. Thursday night, Emily stood at the window of her apartment and watched the city blink its patient constellation while her son's breath ticked warm against her collarbone. She thought of room 208 and how the door had closed, and how she had decided, mid-contraction, mid-leaving, that the rest of her life would be curated with the same precision she gave to a model or a memo. She whispered to the sleepy bundle, "Respect shows up," and felt the sentence settle into her bones like a permanent instruction. Then she set him down, opened the deck for the board's final pre-brief, and slid a new slide in between synergies and roadmap. A single line, "We move at the speed of trust." Because she wanted the people who'd bet $10 billion on velocity to remember that engines run longer when they're tuned to something more durable than ego. Outside, a siren rose and fell. Somewhere, a bus sighed at a curb, and in the apartment's even light, she closed the laptop on a week that had not asked her to be superhuman, only precise. Tomorrow would make her public. Tonight made her ready.
The ballroom glittered like it had been dressed by a jeweler. Crystal chandeliers scattered small constellations across the lacquered floor. A string quartet lifted the air with practiced grace, and cameras floated between tables where name tags doubled as currency, when the master of ceremonies stepped into a breath of hush and reset the night's center of gravity. Daniel, seated at Veronica Steele's right hand, leaned back in the velvet of borrowed importance and let the theater of it stroke his ego. The shape of the stemware, the cut of his suit, the measured warmth of greetings that recognized Veronica first and him as punctuation. Beside him, Veronica wore confidence with the precision of a well-tailored verdict, every glance a ledger, every nod an instruction. The MC's voice rolled over the room. Tonight we honor a record-shaping union in our industry, the $10 billion merger that will redefine capability. And forks paused mid-air, conversations trimmed to attentive silence. Daniel reached for his glass at the same moment the giant screens blinked awake, expecting a logo, a skyline, some anonymous handshake looping on repeat. Instead, a still image bloomed. Emily Hart, in a navy suit, shoulders squared, expression clean and unbothered by the camera's attention, the caption simple and irreversible. Emily Hart, CEO Global Tech, architect of a $10 billion merger. The sound surged, applause that stood on its feet, whistles wrapped in respect rather than spectacle, and Daniel's hand misjudged the rim, champagne slicking onto linen in a cold spill that snapped a waiter to action without distracting the bigger current. He felt the blood move from his face to some far corner of the room and then back, slow and punishing, as the MC enumerated her leadership, the late-night negotiations, the cross-continental legal lattice, the integration plan described as a blueprint for modern consolidation that keeps people at the center. One screen cut to live, and there she was at the dais, smaller than her photograph and somehow larger, breathing once before speaking, and then landing a first line that set the tone. What we build must outlast the news cycle. She didn't thank 1,000 people in a blur. She named teams and functions and 2 junior analysts by first name. And she refused the lure of I, laying the credit out in a we that made even the cynics lower their eyebrows. In the corner of Daniel's vision, Veronica didn't clap. She assessed. When he turned to her for an anchor, she gave him a single, almost leisurely question that felt like a blade under velvet. How did you not know? He had no answer that didn't incriminate his own incuriosity, his own small practiced contempt. He tried on a smirk and found it didn't fit. He reached for a line about fast changes and let it die before it embarrassed him aloud. On stage, Emily outlined the first 90 days with the unshowy authority of someone who had already made real decisions. Stabilization metrics, a people-first cadence, community investment that wouldn't be a press release but a pipeline. Her voice didn't swell for emphasis, it landed. Investors nodded as if their portfolios had relaxed a notch. At their table, a man with a tie the color of money leaned across the centerpiece and murmured to Veronica, "Quite the coup," and she returned a smile that meant, "I know what a coup looks like." Daniel felt himself receding from the circumference of relevance, not banished exactly, just unneeded, like a placeholder kept too long on a slide. His chest ran a replay of room 208, the closed door, the easy exit, and laid it alongside these screens and this applause until the overlap cut him in places pride couldn't bandage. Emily finished without flourish, stepped away to a cluster of handshakes that looked like agreements in embryo. And as she crossed beneath the chandelier's spill of light, the photographer's flash found her with the accuracy of tide. Her phone lit once, some internal confirmation, a text from comms, and she slid it back into a pocket as if even good news could wait its turn. In the aftercurrent, I heard his name used in the past tense in a whisper 2 tables away, and felt the strange vertigo of being a footnote in a story he once assumed he authored. Veronica placed her hand on the tablecloth and spoke almost kindly, which was worse. If you want to be in rooms like this for longer than the dessert course, you'll bring outcomes. And then she turned to greet a partner whose handshake could move markets. The quartet modulated into something celebratory, and the room returned to its glitter, but for Daniel, the light had changed temperature. Across it all, Emily's image lingered on the periphery, steady, scaled to the moment without straining, and the applause he could still hear belonged to a truth he had refused to look at until the screens made it impossible.
The days after the gala did not swell into a victory lap for Emily, so much as contract into the precise, disciplined work she had promised on stage. She started Monday with a 30-minute stand-up in a windowed conference room where she set 3 visible rules on a whiteboard: assume good intent, argue with data, commit with unity, and people greater than optics, and then moved through the week enforcing them softly but without compromise, catching the small slippages that turn into culture rot if leaders pretend not to notice. An engineer who undercut a colleague in a meeting found an invitation on his calendar titled Reset and left with a clear plan and a second chance. A manager who tried to spin bad numbers learned that spun data got rewritten in public, not buried in private. HR rolled out the childcare stipend she'd asked for. Facilities opened a dedicated lactation room with a working lock, the kind of detail that says, "We meant this." And finance published a plain language explainer of comp bands so pay secrecy wouldn't corrode trust. She made time to tour both campuses with a paper cup of coffee in hand, asking operators and receptionists and security guards what was working and what wasn't, writing down the answers as if they were the only agenda that mattered. By midweek, she convened a cross-company design review that looked more like a studio than a status report. Stickies layered on walls, prototypes passed around, a single question anchoring the discussion: what will make this indispensable to the person who isn't in this room? And left with a cut list ruthless enough to save 6 months and a morale boost born of clarity rather than cheerleading. Outside the building, she kept the promises that never make headlines. The community center got its refurbished computer lab, not with a ribbon cutting, but with 20 machines, fresh wiring, and a sign-up sheet for Saturday classes taught by volunteers from her engineering team. Legal finished scrubbing vendor contracts of predatory auto renewals, and comms replaced a draft press release full of confetti verbs with one sentence that sounded like her: "We measure success by what lasts." Meanwhile, the air around Veronica grew thinner for Daniel. The lucrative shimmer of proximity didn't translate into belonging, and the tedious hours between meetings exposed how little of the new world was actually his. The lunch tables he loved were less forgiving after Emily's announcement. Introductions that once landed now came with a pause, the small private audit people perform when weighing someone's story against the evidence in front of them. He replied to emails with desperate speed, overpromised in 3 threads, and learned the hard way that Veronica did not mistake motion for momentum. On Thursday, she slid a single-page scorecard across a glass desk, targets missed, introductions that yielded nothing, a comment about signal to noise, and told him with immaculate calm that access was a lease, not a deed. That night, alone in a guest room that smelled faintly of hotel linen, he thumbed through old photos, stopped on an image of Emily laughing with rain in her hair, and understood with the bluntness of an empty calendar that charm is not a strategy, and that leaving the delivery room had been less a choice than an admission of who he was willing to be when it counted. Emily did not track any of this. She was busy writing a 5-slide deck for Friday's all-hands titled First 90 Days, What You Can Expect, where each slide contained only verbs: listen, integrate, simplify, build, report, because she wanted the team to feel motion they could join, not slogans they could only applaud. The meeting itself felt less like a broadcast and more like a conversation. She named the decisions already made, the experiments they'd run, the metrics they'd publish every other Wednesday at 4 p.m., and then took questions without a handler, saying, "I don't know yet," 3 times, and "we'll fix that by Tuesday," twice. After, she walked the hallway slower than usual so anyone hesitant could catch her shoulder for a private ask. Back at her apartment, night hummed low against the windows as she swayed her son to sleep, the week's edges softening at the sight of tiny fingers uncurling. She placed him in the crib, returned to the kitchen island, and wrote a note to herself on a square of paper she'd stick to the underside of her laptop. Hold the center. People, product, proof. Across town, Daniel stared at a blank text to Emily and deleted it, knowing a typed apology would sound smaller than the room he had walked out of. The weekend stretched ahead like a choice: recalibrate or keep pretending.
And for the first time since the limousine door had closed, he felt the full cost of a story built on shortcuts, while she, already turned toward Monday, set 2 alarms, one for an investor call and one for a pediatric checkup, and smiled at the ordinary elegance of a life that did not need to announce its worth to keep it.
3 weeks after the gala, Daniel's sedan idled before the Hart Estate's steel gates, the wipers ticking a nervous metronome as he rehearsed apologies that sounded like lines borrowed from a play he'd never believed in. He pressed the intercom and said Emily's name, and her voice came back through the speaker with a steady civility that made his chest tighten. No edge, no tremor, just the practiced calm of someone who no longer needed the outcome to validate her choice. The gate slid open with a hydraulic sigh, and the drive curled through gardens that remembered how often someone had cared for them, past a fountain whose soft rush made the house seem less a prize than a promise kept. He stopped beside broad steps and climbed with a florist's hostage in his fist, bright flowers that tried too hard. Emily opened the door before his knuckles met wood. Their son balanced on her hip. The child's fingers nested in the collar of her cream sweater, as if grasping the only certainty he knew. She looked different in the way people look when boundaries are no longer provisional, lighter around the mouth, clearer in the eyes, her posture unnegotiated. He said she looked well and heard the thinness of it. She asked why he was here and left no space for theatrics. He held out the bouquet and a spool of words. He was sorry, he had been proud, he had chosen wrong doors for the right reasons, or the right doors for the wrong reasons. He wanted to be present now. He wanted to be a father and maybe someday a partner again. She did not take the flowers. A mistake is missing a turn, she said evenly. A choice is taking the exit you planned. And the sentence sat between them like a ledger neither could dispute. He reached for contrition's better costume. He had watched the announcement. He was proud of her. He had underestimated what she could carry. He wanted to stand beside what she was building. And she reminded him, without heat, that he had not merely underestimated, but abandoned. That room 208 had witnessed who he was when asked to show up. He flinched, then said he'd been dazzled, tempted, drunk on proximity to power. She nodded once, as if logging his input, and shifted their son to the other hip, the motion small and absolute. Logistics over lament. He asked for a chance, just one, and she didn't answer the plea so much as replace its frame. Their son would know him and know the truth. He would have access structured by reliability, not nostalgia. He would be given the dignity of facts, not fairy tales engineered to protect adult pride. Daniel said he could change, and she said change would be measured, not declared. He asked if forgiveness was possible, and she said forgiveness was not a return ticket. He blinked at the familiar phrase as if he'd heard it somewhere before, and realized he was only now fluent in its meaning. He said Veronica wasn't what he thought. Emily lifted a brow, and I am not what you thought either. Not cruel, simply complete. The child babbled, reached for a curl of her hair, and she smiled without looking away from Daniel, the kind of smile that comes from anchoring in what matters rather than winning an argument. He tried humor and watched it die unheard. He tried silence and discovered it told the truth faster. Finally, he placed the bouquet gently on the step, as if setting down an instrument he did not know how to play, and said the first sentence that didn't beg, that he was sorry for leaving the delivery room, and that no achievement of hers made his departure less small. She nodded once more, the nod of a judge and a parent and a person who has learned that compassion and consequence can share a sentence without canceling each other. "Email my assistant," she said. "We'll formalize a schedule." And he understood the mercy inside the administrative, a future for the child that was reliable even if affection wasn't. She shifted her son again and added, Show up on time every time with nothing to prove and no one to impress. Then stepped back. The door's weight found the jam with a sound that was not a slam, simply an ending. He stood for a breath, recognized that the gate would open for him only as a father, not as a husband, and walked to the car lighter than he had arrived, which is its own kind of grief. Inside, Emily set the flowers in a tall glass vase, not as reconciliation, not as keepsake, but as repurposed remainder, trimmed the stems, added water, and placed them on the kitchen island near a stack of product drafts and a wooden rattle. She watched her son chase sunlight across the floorboards and felt the house exhale around them, not with triumph, but with the ordinary, muscular peace of a life aligned. Later, she would email legal about custody language clear enough to protect everyone, and comms about an upcoming interview where leadership would mean showing up. But for now, she moved a vase an inch to the left and whispered to the room, to the boy, to herself, "Respect arrives on time, and love is what..."
By the time the quarter turned, Emily's calendar looked like a finely tuned instrument. Strategy sessions slotted beside pediatric checkups, product milestones braided with nursery play, and every commitment aligned to the 3 verbs she'd written on the all-hands slides: listen, integrate, build. Mornings began with a quiet sweep through dashboards she insisted be understandable without a decoder ring. Activation, retention, burn. Followed by a standing 30 minutes with the integration leads where she opened with people before product. Any friction, any burnout, any invisible labor. When an architect admitted he'd been holding the team together off the clock, she shifted resources the same day and put his name in for the promotion pipeline, making visible what old cultures had trained people to bury. HR's childcare stipend got used and measured instead of photographed. Legal reported the last predatory clause scrubbed from legacy contracts, and comms published a short note about the refurbished community lab only after the first cohort of students logged hours on the machines. That Saturday, Emily sat at a plastic table in the lab's back room with a paper cup of instant coffee, while 2 of her engineers taught version control to teens who had never pushed code beyond a school network. And when a girl in a yellow hoodie asked, "Do I have to choose between being a person and being good at this?" Emily answered, "No, our job is to build a world where those are the same choice." Then offered the girl a summer internship application and the email of a mentor who would actually answer. At the office, she instituted Open Design Wednesdays, no slides, just prototypes, where titles checked their emails at the door and junior contributors were the only ones allowed to hold the marker. The rule felt small and turned out to be large. Velocity improved, yes, but so did voice. When an early career PM caught a cascading edge case in a new permissions model, Emily stopped the room to show how humility compounds quality. She made it a habit to end meetings with a sentence that started, "Here's what I heard," and another that started, "Here's what we'll do by Friday," collapsing the distance between empathy and execution so the culture could learn the rhythm of trust. In public, she kept interviews brief and specific, declining metaphors that made success sound mystical. On an investor call, she refused to juice short-term guidance in exchange for a headline, explaining calmly that durability outperforms drama. The stock ticked, wandered, then steadied, and the board, some grudging, most relieved, began to relax into the rare sensation of leadership that did not require translation. Nights were still soft-lit and ordinary, laundry folded beside a laptop, a bottle warmed while a query ran, a stuffed elephant wearing a burp cloth like a cape, because she refused to outsource the parts of life that made the rest of it make sense. Across the city, a different cadence dissolved. Veronica Steele replaced Daniel on a calendar with the efficiency of a keystroke, sliding a new name into the outreach block and reassigning his in-progress threads to people with outcomes rather than anecdotes. When he asked for more runway, she gave him a contract addendum that translated to more accountability. Then, when targets didn't land, an exit meeting that was polite, sealed with an NDA, and final in the way closed systems are. The penthouse air thinned into silence that smelled like an unbooked future. And Daniel, for the first time without borrowed momentum, confronted the unflattering arithmetic of charm minus competence. He tried to draft Emily a long apology, then deleted it and booked a therapist instead, because a letter that asked for absolution would be the old pattern in fancier font. He emailed Emily's assistant, as instructed, arrived early for supervised pickups, kept visits boring on purpose, parks, pancakes, picture books, and learned how to be a father without trying to audition for husband. After 3 months of showing up on time with nothing to prove, the supervision clause lifted, not as a reward but as a reflection of consistency. He discovered that reliability, performed long enough, becomes a kind of peace. Meanwhile, Emily nominated 2 women for stretch roles long denied to them, greenlit a small skunk works team with a charter to kill the project if Discovery proved it should die, and published a quarterly letter that treated employees like adults: what went right, what didn't, what they'd do next. The letter ended with 5 names, individual contributors whose choices had quietly bent outcomes toward better, and a line that said, simply, "This is how we scale." When a journalist tried to bait her into a soundbite about revenge success, she smiled and said she didn't traffic in storylines that shrank the work. Later that night, rocking her son through a stubborn patch of fussiness, she hummed a tune her mother had used and thought about the strange way storms become weather, weather becomes memory, and memory becomes instruction. She set him down drowsy and checked a text from the community center director, a photo of the yellow hoodie intern grinning beside a whiteboard full of branching logic, and felt the day click into place. Her phone lit with a calendar nudge for tomorrow's listening hour, a block she guarded like revenue. She turned off the lamp, walked the slow length of the hall, and whispered the sentence that had sutured her story together since room 208. Respect shows up. In the dark, the house answered with the soft declarations of a life aligned. HVAC, a night truck downshifting on a distant street, the regular breath of a sleeping child, and she let the quiet finish the thought she no longer needed to say out loud. And love stays.
By the time the first-year anniversary of the merger neared, the noise had settled into a hum that Emily could tune as easily as a radio, and the life she had built, equal parts steel and lullaby, held its shape without asking for justification. Dawn found her at the kitchen island with a mug cooling beside a color-coded agenda, her son padding in footy pajamas to park a toy truck at her ankle while she skimmed a brief titled "What We'll Keep and What We'll Let Go," a discipline she insisted on quarterly so momentum didn't calcify into habit. The company, once 2 wary organisms, now moved with a single gait. Onboarding flowed, architecture simplified, a flagship product shipped with permissions that actually respected users, and the community lab ran weekend classes so routinely that the custodian kept extra extension cords coiled like friendly snakes under the folding table. On a Wednesday, she stood in a warehouse lit by skylights to watch a pilot assembly line spin up a hardware accessory sourced through vendors who signed a code of conduct clause legal had written to mean something, and when a reporter asked offhand whether she believed doing good ever slowed doing well, she smiled and said the terms were impoverished when split, then excused herself to take a FaceTime from the nursery where her son demanded she admire a tower of blocks as tall as a giraffe. Daniel arrived that Saturday for pickup 5 minutes early, as he now always did, hair damp from a shower taken like a ritual of respect. He had become a man of short sentences and specific plans: park, pancakes, picture books, nap. And the steadiness had worn grooves of trust that made conversation less brittle. On the porch, he thanked Emily for the custody calendar's clarity, and without theater, mentioned he'd taken a lower-paying role at a mid-sized firm that valued results over dinners, that therapy was slow and necessary, that apologies were verbs. She nodded, no absolution, no ice, then bent to zip her son's jacket while the boy narrated a saga about a stuffed elephant's bravery during bath time. After they left, she walked back through rooms sunning in late light and felt the house hold her decisions the way a good frame holds a photograph, present but not performative. At work, she greenlit a kill list review where teams nominated beloved features for retirement if the maintenance cost outpaced user value. They sunsetted 2 darlings and freed up enough capacity to build the accessibility module a customer coalition had begged for since before the merger. She wrote an internal note that began, "We don't worship artifacts," and ended, "We maintain a living thing," and the team replied with gifts and quiet relief. The board meeting that quarter lasted 47 minutes, her favorite kind, because the numbers matched the narrative and the narrative matched the choices.
When one director floated an acquisition that sparkled but didn't fit, she said, "Not now," and moved them to the line item about scholarships, which had doubled after a vendor renegotiation yielded unexpected savings. Later, at the community lab, the girl in the yellow hoodie, now an intern with a badge and a cafeteria nickname, demoed a proof of concept to a semicircle of kids who looked at code like it was a door. Emily clapped from the back and wiped at an eye she blamed on the dust that old buildings exhale when filled with new purpose. That night, after bath and books, her son slept with his hand fanned on the pillow like he was keeping the room in place. Emily sat at the desk under the window where the city's patient blink reached her in squares of light, and wrote a letter she didn't plan to send to anyone. 5 sentences to herself about leadership she could live with. Tell the truth early, take the hit cleanly, measure what matters, widen the hallway behind you, go home for dinner as often as you can. She slid the page into a folder labeled Future, beside a crayon drawing titled Mom at Work, where her stick figure hair looked like sunbeams. Her phone buzzed with a text from comms about an award nomination, and she replied, "Only if there's no speech," then set the device face down because recognition mattered less than rhythm. Across town, Daniel sat on a thrifted couch in a new apartment that smelled like laundry and pepper he actually cooked with, drafting a budget that had room for soccer cleats and nothing for pretense. He looked at a photo taken that morning, his son mid-giggle, syrup on his chin, and felt gratitude uncomplicated by fantasy. He would show up tomorrow and the day after, and that would be the sentence he kept writing until it was no longer remarkable, just true. Near midnight, rain came soft and familiar, tapping the windows like a friend who remembers the first night they met. Emily stood there a moment and let the sound fold the year into a single breathable thing. Room 208, the closed door, the limo, the ballroom, the porch, the lab, the bedtime, and understood that triumph had been a poor word for what she wanted. What she had now was alignment, the work that paid the life that corrected the work, the house that held them both. She turned off the lamp, checked the small chest rising under the quilt one last time, and whispered the line that had become less a mantra than a measurement. Respect shows up. From the dark came an answer she trusted because she'd built it, quiet, steady, unshowy as oxygen, and she let sleep claim her like a vote of confidence in a future she no longer had to imagine to believe.